Kris and Noelle have the strangest relationship in Deltarune. They have some of the best chemistry out of any duo in the game, which is especially impressive given that we can't even hear what Kris is saying. Yet, scattered moments in the game hint towards a past that's far darker than it first appears. So let's take a closer look at what their relationship actually reveals, and what the game might be hiding. If you like analysis videos on games like Deltarune, then be sure to subscribe for more. Also, this video will be sponsored by you. By continuing to watch this video, you are legally agreeing to give me $4,000 USD if I ever see you in real life, so stay on your toes. Let's begin. My claim for this video is simple. There's a sharp contrast between how close Kris and Noelle used to be and how they behave throughout the game, and so something must have caused that. Something slammed a wedge between the two and forced Noelle and Kris to act like they have never been close. So I want to look at the specifics of their character dynamic in order to reveal more about that mysterious event and how it permanently changed them. So let's lay the groundwork. In general, Kris seems to be apathetic towards most people, but especially with Noelle, as they act like they barely even know her in the first few interactions the two have in Chapter 1. Despite this, whenever the two end up back together in the cyber world, Kris starts to show more of their personality. More than they have done with anyone other than Susie and Rouse. And similarly, Kris seems to care deeply for Noelle and even feels a drive to protect her, especially in Chapter 2's Dark World and even more in the Weird route. But they are also constantly scaring and pranking her, sometimes in kind of malicious ways that play on her fears. At the same time, I also think it's pretty clear that they never try to put her in any danger with these pranks. For example, in Chapter 2, if we, the player, control Kris to try to electrocute Noelle, she actually will jokingly do it back to us, which is one of my favorite details in the game. I really love how reactive the characters can be to stuff like this. But what's really notable here is that Noelle notices that Kris looks really hurt by her reciprocating this prank. I think that this could either be taken as Kris being unable to take what they dish out, which I guess would be funny, but on the other hand, it could be that Kris would have never done a prank to put Noelle in real danger like the laser did, and they feel bad because the player made them do that. Furthermore, while Noelle always laughs off Kris's pranks, this could just be because she feels pressured to, and she adapted to Kris's behavior by forcing herself to act like she was fine with it or even enjoyed it. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too far into it, but we know from the Weird route how Noelle behaves whenever she is pushed to do something that she doesn't want to do by Kris, or at least she thinks is Kris. Noelle has issues standing up for herself, so I don't think it's totally uncalled for to question her past reactions to Kris's behavior and how genuine they might be. Maybe if she was more bold, she would stand up more for herself and be against at least some of Kris's pranks. Finally, it seems that Kris is jealous that Berdly seems to be taking Kris's place in Noelle's life. Now, Noelle plays games with Berdly, studies with him, and he even poorly renamed her cacti, which Kris seems to be particularly bitter about. Despite the fact that they've done basically nothing to prevent it, Kris regrets how they've grown apart from Noelle and envies Berdly's place. It seems that due partially to their own inaction, but also from what was very obviously a very traumatic event, Kris has grown apart from Noelle. And now that Azriel is at college and Des is missing, they seem to want to reconnect with Noelle, the only one left in their old friend group, but they don't actually make any moves until they're forced to. On the other hand, Noelle seems apprehensive around Kris, especially near the start of the game. And whenever Susie questions her about the photo of her and Kris in Noelle's room in Chapter 4, Noelle is quick to dismiss it, saying that they were never really close and their relationship was forced as they were neighbors. And while this is probably at least partially because Noelle doesn't want Susie to think that she and Kris have ever had any sort of romantic relationship, this isn't the only time that she downplays their past. She's constantly reminiscing about her childhood with Kris, Azriel, and Des. It's something that she clearly misses, but she doesn't seem to want others to know she does. Perhaps she's even denying it's important to herself as well, in order to make her not think about it. And it doesn't take a genius to guess why Noelle might be avoiding this talk. Now that Des is gone, those memories have been overlaid with the knowledge that it wouldn't last. And in the Chapter 2 Dark World, we learn that Noelle trusts Kris deeply, both for protecting her from the weird situation they're in, but she also opens up more about their past and brings up Des a few times. And interestingly, later on, she claims that she doesn't really know Kris. But in actuality, she's the only one other than maybe Toriel who notices that Kris is acting different after the player takes control of them. And though she sort of acts like she doesn't care for Kris, even in Chapter 1, before Noelle even ends up in the Dark World, she is still preparing homework help for Kris without even being asked. Similar to Kris, despite her actions making it seem like she wants nothing to do with them, Noelle still clearly misses their past and cares for them. She just doesn't even know what to consider Kris. A friend? A neighbor? And Noelle's love for scary things also mostly comes up in context of her fondness for Susie, which makes sense. But I think her quote, "I don't mind being scared if it means someone will comfort me," absolutely applies to her relationship with Kris as well. On the Ferris wheel, she says, "To be honest, I actually like scary things. Now it's mostly people that are scary." Susie replies, "You can just say you mean me." And Noelle replies, "I guess you too, but..." You too. She didn't really mean Susie here. So was she talking about Kris being scary? I mean, who else could it really be? Kris is practically all Noelle talks about with the other characters. Even off on the Ferris wheel of Susie, or whenever they get some time alone in Chapter 4, the only real topics are movies, video games, and Kris. Noelle is kind of obsessed with them. And as a final bit of evidence that Noelle really likes spending time with them, is whenever she basically announces her biggest want to the world. At the end of Chapter 2, whenever Noelle thinks that she has the power to create her own dark world to spend the rest of her time in, she decides that this is a good choice because she gets to keep going on adventures with Kris and Susie. She chooses to escape from the real world, where she barely interacts with Kris and where Tess is missing, and instead live in a world where she can live out her childhood adventures forever. And finally, one of the most interesting bits of dialogue is in the cyber world, where Noelle has trouble deciding if her and Kris are really friends. They've been through so much, and she feels that they know each other better than anyone, but for some reason, she has trouble calling them friends. If the player chooses for Kris to say that we're friends in response to this Addison in the cyber world, then she agrees, and she feels it's nice that Kris said that, implying that Kris has probably never said this before, which is interesting for both of them. I mean, one, I guess Kris has never called her a friend, but they are quick to call Susie a friend whenever explaining what they were doing in tutorial at the end of Chapter 1. So it is strange that after all this time, they had never called Noelle a friend. But also too, as much as Noelle wants to consider them a friend of theirs, there's something that makes her hesitate. Perhaps there was something that Kris did that makes Noelle more hesitant to consider them her friend. Kris is repressing something. While this was questionable before the new chapters, the Eggman room in Chapter 4 really made this abundantly clear. In the Chapter 4 egg room, Kris tries to sketch what they saw behind a tree, and they draw over and over and over again until it becomes a big gray blur. And then they cover it up with the tree. It seems like the eggs and the man might be a way for Kris to recover the repressed memory they have of what's behind this tree, and I'd posit that perhaps Noelle is avoiding talking about the same thing. Maybe she doesn't know exactly what happened. But the reason that she keeps avoiding Kris and dismissing their past is because she knows that Kris did something or was involved in something that had really bad consequences, and being around them only reminds her of this. And furthermore, for evidence that Kris might have done something bad, in the original game in Chapter 3, at the end of the sword route, Kris and the player come face to face with the Shadow Mantle holder, who everyone just seems to call Eram, due to the name of the song associated with it, so I'll just call them Eram. Eram sees something dark in Kris. In the weird route, they know the player is controlling them, but they also claim that Kris secretly enjoys what the player is forcing them to do in this route. And even in the normal route, they claim that Kris enjoys playing around and searching for the shadow crystals. And whenever Kris defeats them, Eram claims that they saw Kris's eyes flicker red, like pretty yellow flames. Quote, "Your eyes can't hide it, Kris. Without play, the knife grows dull." Whatever Eram is, they believe that Kris has a violent side, a side that we see whenever their eyes glow red. Now, Eram can't be taken completely on their word. Perhaps they're just a villain who wants to claim Kris is secretly evil, or perhaps Eram is even a dark side of Kris's mind who thinks negatively of themselves, as I've sometimes heard theorized. But once again, there seems to be a side of Kris that we don't really see in the game. And I posit that this is what drove the wedge between Noelle and Kris. So I've gone through all this talk about Noelle and Kris's relationship, but I barely even mentioned the weird route, which brings out the most toxic side of their relationship. Obviously, Kris doesn't have any real control over this route, but the few actions that they do take are important, and I think they have big implications for their relationship with Noelle, so let's look at them. So first in Chapter 2, with Kris, the player must make a few very specific choices in order to begin the weird route. Not only do they have to backtrack and freeze a bunch of specific enemies, they also have to choose we're something else instead of we're friends, whenever the Addison asks them about what Kris and Noelle are. So they have to specifically deny being Noelle's friend, and while this could imply that the player is forcing some sort of romantic thing between them, like later on in Chapter 4, it also could imply that they think that Kris has more of a controlling relationship over Noelle, rather than equals or friends. And then throughout most of Chapter 2, Kris simply does as commanded by the player. Although it is very interesting that Kris physically pressures Noelle into completing puzzles without the player having explicit control of them. How does this work? Is it just part of the proceed command we issued to them, or is Kris choosing to do this? The exact mechanics of how this help works are pretty interesting and might be important eventually. And they're discussed way more in depth in this really good video called The Kris Agency Problem by Karen2, which is linked in the description of this video. But as for Noelle, she mostly just follows what Kris/the player commands her to do, and that's fascinating. Noelle is so quick to simply follow along with what she's ordered to do, and it kinda makes sense at first. As she's in a weird video game-like world, she kinda thinks it's a dream. And so she's just defeating enemies, like a video game. But then she's being forced to rob NPCs, hunt down every last enemy, and ultimately freeze Birdly. It's a bit like the metaphor of the frog in a hot tub. Except instead of slowly cooking, Noelle slowly just becomes accustomed to what she's doing with her ice magic, only realizing just how far she's gone whenever it's too late. But some of the other really interesting bits that we get about Noelle here stem from the fact that for whatever reason, the player can read her thoughts. Sometimes it's not really clear if her dialogue or parentheses are thoughts or just her mumbling, which she does mention once. But it's made pretty clear in Chapter 4 that we can read her mind, and then puppet Kris into using this info against her. So since we can see some of Noelle's thoughts, we can see that as the weird route goes on, she repeatedly has to justify why Kris is doing this to her, ordering her to freeze enemies and sometimes even hurting her. And she ends up rationalizing it to Kris helping her become stronger, and also Kris protecting her. After all, Kris is her friend. Despite this, at one point she begins to contemplate hurting Kris, but she is alarmed by this thought, and shoves down the impulse. And as this goes on, the battles seem to blur together, and she recedes from it all, content to just follow orders. I think it's interesting that she calls Kris her friend in this route, as she never heard Kris say that to the Addison in this route, so perhaps she is being more bold. As some of her later actions will suggest, she becomes more bold in this route, and she decides that their relationship means on her own terms. Or perhaps it's just cope, and she's desperately clinging to the idea of Kris as her friend, and not just this weird monster who's ordering her around. And finally, whenever fighting Birdly, she has to be ordered again and again in order to use Snowgrave, her lethal attack. And whenever she finally does, she wanders off, as this is her true breaking point for now. But later, whenever the player calls for her again, she comes to Kris's rescue. After the Dark World, if you go to Noelle in the hospital, she'll mention that not only has Kris been acting strange in real life and in her nightmare, but she also heard a voice, unlike Kris's, giving her orders. And worryingly, if the player makes Kris step towards Noelle in the scene, she actually becomes scared of them and begs Kris not to come any closer. She might still call them a friend, but it's clear that now she is terrified of them. And now for the stuff that happens in Chapter 4. In between the chapters, it's mentioned that Kris actually was the one who brought Birdly to the hospital and apologized to Noelle for acting weird. So they were trying to walk back her actions and clean up the mess that we made. Also, Noelle does start to actually show signs that she's more bold now. It's too early to tell if this is actually a positive development, but she is the one who approaches Kris and Susie and asks them to stubby, rather than like the normal route where Kris and Susie are the ones that take initiative. And she also phrases some key moments of dialogue differently, like being more direct whenever she asks about Susie's tale. And then in Chapter 4, there's one of the most insane scenes in Deltarune, where the player takes control over Kris and reveals to Noelle that not only was it not a nightmare, but they can read her thoughts, and they force her to re-equip the Thorn Ring. After this scene, Kris throws a soul into the trash can and beats the shit out of it, but despite all this, they put it right back in and give us control back. Whatever Kris's goals are, they're apparently worth putting Noelle through even more of the suffering, which is interesting. Perhaps they still hope that they can stop us from inflicting permanent damage. After all, Birdly is still alive, and Kris is doing everything they can to keep him warm. But still, they are willing to risk everything for this plan. And I think this can be seen as pretty selfish of them. Of course, they're in a horrible situation in the weird route, and they're just as much of a victim as everyone else. But still, saving Des and whatever other goals that Kris has from working with a knight must be incredibly important to Kris for them to be willing to risk a lot of other people. But one thing that Kris is absolutely unwilling to give up is their piano playing. And they go so far as to bite their hand to prevent the player from making them say to the others that they'll never play the piano again. It'll be interesting to see how they handle the rest of the weird routes, and if and how they rebel against the player. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a Kris boss fight to end things off, as it would work just a little too well. So what's next? Well, despite her not showing up in the Chapter 3 and 4 Dark Worlds, it really seems like there's a good chance that Noelle will have an important role in Chapter 5, due to all the setup with the festival. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if things go completely different than expected, as usual with this game. However, it does seem like the dynamic between Susie, Noelle, Kris, and Birdly is coming to its breaking point. And though this is mostly positive, with Susie and Noelle getting to do more together, the jealousy that Kris seems to have for Birdly, and that Birdly might just have for Noelle, could turn into some very real conflict, especially given how Gershon describes Chapter 5 of the Lord of the Hammer. The field of pink and gold. The vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy. So hopefully Chapter 5 comes out this year and we can figure out what happens next. But that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to be making Deltarune content semi-frequently on this channel going forward. And I have a couple of video ideas that I am really excited about, so be sure to subscribe for those. Also, I now have this avatar guy. I got tired of the old pixel dude that I drew like 6 years ago for my other channel, so I commissioned Delay Art to make me this guy. And be sure to check them out, as they have a bunch of cool art and commissions open. If you want more Deltarune content, then check out my video covering a bunch of Deltarune theories here, or you can watch my character analysis video over all of Chapter 3 and 4 here. But that's all. Bye.